The U.S. Zionist escalation in the Middle East has now entered its 93rd day, with the region facing growing uncertainty. As the Pakistan-mediated ceasefire remains fragile, Washington's rhetoric is becoming more confrontational. Speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, U.S. War Secretary Pete Hegseth threatened to resume military strikes against Iran if negotiations are to fail. At the same time, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that he called Operation Economic Fury, involving the seizure of $1 billion in Iranian cryptocurrency assets and properties abroad. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump's recent visit to Beijing to meet President Xi Jinping failed to pressure China into distancing itself from Tehran, raising new questions about the limits of American influence. As Washington focuses on blockade in the Strait of Hormuz and tightening pressure on energy routes, it continues to provide full support to Israel. In Gaza, the Israeli occupation has announced plans to expand its military control from 60% to 70% of the territory. Between the threat of a wider regional war, mounting economic pressure on the global South countries, and the use of diplomacy to shield Israeli expansion, several questions are now being raised. Is Washington pursuing a conflict mainly to protect Israeli interests? And how long can the international community continue to accept these contradictions? These questions and more are put to my panel shortly on All 24 News Special. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this All 24 News special coverage with me, Karim Fazakri. And before we bring in our guests, let's take a look at this report and then we get back to the discussion.
Iranian flags were waved high alongside pictures of the late Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and his successor Mujtaba Khamenei. This was the scene in Tehran's Inqilab Square on Friday night as people gathered to show support for their Supreme Leader while voicing distrust of statements coming from Washington.
If what he's saying is true, it shows that his blockade has failed, and what he had in mind did not happen. He could not overcome us, and in order not to be humiliated any further, he says we are ending the blockade. Now we have to see how truthful he is.
The whole world is saying that he is a crazy, stupid person. He doesn't stand by his word. He is a complete liar.
US President Donald Trump has said any extension of the ceasefire would require Iran to end its chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz and giving it enriched uranium, conditions Tehran has not accepted. In Inqilab Square in Iran's capital, demonstrators echoed their government stance, saying Iran is a sovereign nation and should not be pressured into making concessions, whether on its enriched uranium stockpiles or the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
I even believe we made the mistake in 2015 when we handed over several tons of uranium. It was a very big mistake. Enriched uranium has high material value, both spiritual and material. It is like part of our soil. Why should we hand it over? The Strait of Hormuz must remain closed until our leader announces otherwise. We will say the same.
After weeks of mounting threats filled with contradictory statements that left the world holding its breath, Iranians are more than ever determined to resist US pressure. Many who gathered here believe that Trump failed to achieve the goals he set out at the outset of the war and is now seeking to reshape the narrative.
To discuss the geopolitical, economic and legal dimensions of these developments, I am joined tonight by a distinguished panel of guests. We have Dr. Khodr Zarour. He's a MENA U.S. foreign policy, strategy, and international security expert at North Carolina State University. He joins us from Raleigh. Hello there, Professor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. And we're also pleased to have Dr. Piotr Pietersak, international relations theorist and political author from Vistula University and the Institut Nascindi think tank. He joins us from Warsaw. Hello there, Doctor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Good evening, Karim. It's a pleasure as usual.
Thank you. And we're also thrilled to have Dr. Irfan Raja, geopolitical analyst and media professional. He joins us from London. Hello, Dr. Raja, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Karim. Thank you.
Thank you. And we also have Dr. Yvonne Ridley, leader of Scotland Workers' Party, former journalist and British author. She joins us from Glasgow. Hello there, ma'am, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Great to see you.
Great to see you too. All right, let's begin the discussion with you, Dr. Zarour. So if we come to look at the recent reports, we have U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth threatening from Singapore to resume military strikes against Iran if a big deal is not reached, while the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is demanding the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz on Washington's terms. Is the United States hence trying to impose new rules of engagement through military pressure, or does this reflect frustration inside an administration fighting a war that many see as serving Israeli interests more than American ones?
Good evening. Thank you, and thank you to your panelists. It appears that the White House is divided. You have the war hawks that wants to continue the military operation, and you have the other side that are eyeing the 26 November elections. So this is the division. That's why we have misstatements, conflicting reports. I think Mr. Hegseth is trying to rally people around the war machinery. We have seen that wars cannot solve all the problems. Actually, it destabilized the region. It's already destabilized. We have seen continuous violation of international law, not only from the U.S., but with the U.S. protection, Israel continues to bomb Lebanon, Gaza, and threatening on a daily basis to resume conflict with Tehran. So I think the Secretary of War is only trying to speak to people at his base and not to the entire international community, where support for the war has been declining for the last several weeks. War has not ended. The war has not ended the nuclear standoff, and it's not expected to do so in near future.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that all this diplomatic marathon that's been taking place in Pakistan is not going to yield any fruition, Dr. Zarour?
Well, I think when you have too many players, first it started with Pakistan, now with China, Turkey, Russia, the Gulf states are all playing a role in this conflict. And of course, as you know, when I say when you have too many chefs, that ruins the pot or spoils the pot. And that's what we are seeing. We don't really know. We started with nuclear standoff. It ended up with Strait of Hormuz, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, renationalizing the Strait of Hormuz. And now we're talking about nuclear, we're talking about long-range missiles. So I don't think the White House or even the Israelis have a game plan. I think it's meddling through without a clear vision or clear guidance. Mr. Trump wants clear victory. He is not going to get that. We have seen 3 months of fighting or 3 months of peacemaking or diplomacy. We have not seen an end to the war. So I think diplomacy could play a role, but that diplomacy have to have teeth and has to have stability in the White House. We have seen divided statements from the White House, and this doesn't lead to a successful conclusion in my point of view.
Mm-hmm. So if Iran is not to make any serious concessions that would make the President Donald Trump look good, then we're not going to have any solution.
It appears to be so. I think, again, the White House is looking for a clear victory. This is the expectation February 28, 2026, when there was a military strike. The expectation in the White House and the Pentagon and Tel Aviv, the expectation was maybe this is where the Iranian people will rally against the regime, and the regime will collapse. That did not happen. In fact, the opposite has happened. We have seen the Iranians rallying around the regime, and in fact, the right wingers, if you will, in the Iranian regime have become more powerful, more influential in the diplomatic circle, and that's what we have not seen an end in sight. Nor do we expect an end in sight, as long as the demands in Washington, I mean, they have raised the bar so high in Washington, that bar has to come down a bit to be successful.
Amazing, Dr. Zarur. Now, let me bring in Dr. Peter Sack now and turn to international law. Dr. Peter Sack, as I was discussing with Dr. Zarur, and as you may have been listening, it seems that Washington is determined to have serious concessions from the Iranians so as Washington would look good. And among the techniques that they are seeking or using to reach that end, they are technically applying a lot of pressures, including the one that we hear about Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who openly announced the seizure of $1 billion in Iranian crypto assets. Now, from an international relations perspective, how does the global community view a superpower blockading a sovereign nation's coast and confiscating its wealth? Do critiques have grounds whatsoever to describe this as an economic coercion and piracy?
Well, thank you much for this question. For sure, this is an interesting strategy. You see, a very interesting strategy of someone who is not having exit strategy and perhaps they don't know what they are doing. Blocking the cryptocurrency of Iran, it's another example of the fact that basically beggars can be choosers. As a matter of fact, Iranians' funds have been blocked ever since 1979, and it's not $1 billion, it's more than 100, if not 120 billion US dollars. United States have used basically the blocking assets of Iran as a negotiating tool for the last couple of decades, as a matter of fact, and they haven't succeeded in changing the policy of Iranian regime. So I'm not sure what the American politicians try to achieve, but surely they have no idea what they are doing. But it's nothing unusual, because when we look into the case of Cuba, Fidel Castro outlived 13 American presidents. When we look into the example of Soviet Union, basically Soviet Union was also sanctioned for 7 decades, if not more. And yes, it collapsed eventually, but it didn't change the policy of the regime. Look at the policy of the West towards Russia after the Russian war in Ukraine. Ever since 2022, basically, United States, European Union, and the Western world tries to pressurize Putin to withdraw from Ukraine. 20 different types of sanctions have been imposed, and nothing changed, basically. And the only one example of sanctions which actually worked effectively was the sanction which was imposed on Bashar al-Assad's regime in 2011, basically after the outbreak of the Arab Spring in the country. So on one level, it pressurized Bashar al-Assad to leave the country in 2024. But the sanctions in general, embargoes, they don't affect the regime. They don't change the policy of the regimes in power. They affect the people. They affect the most vulnerable members of the society. And if I can just elaborate with the Syria example for a brief moment, I will tell you that basically a very clear example of how sanctions backfire is the earthquakes in 2003, which happened in Syria and Turkey. International community was able to rescue, to help Turkey back then, and the international community was blocked from supporting Syrian citizens when they actually needed. So sanctions don't work. When we try to change the behavior of the regimes, the best way is to persuade them with some good example, or try to negotiate it, or try to find the diplomatic solution. But pressurizing regimes or waging wars against Iran, as the case example shows, clearly backfires. So hopefully the war will end soon. Hopefully the Strait of Hormuz will be unblocked. And hopefully there is a way to persuade Iranian government to start respecting human rights of its own citizens.
Thank you. That was clear. Now, let's move to another point with you, Dr. Raja. If we look at the developments on the ground, despite the U.S. naval blockade, we have seen the Philippines, for example, receiving a major shipment of Iranian oil. And hence, I ask, has Washington miscalculated Iran's deterrence capabilities? And how important is Pakistan's mediation in preventing this fragile ceasefire from collapsing?
Well, thank you for asking this important question. I think, yes, I agree with you because first, the American regime change policy in Iran has backfired. In fact, actually, it's united Iranians more than before. As you can see on social media, lots of videos coming up from different cities across Iran where people are chanting slogans, and they are more united than pre-war. So that the Americans failed on political grounds. Then they also failed in technology as well. Their F-35 is down. Their F-22, the different, in terms of technology, they couldn't be able to beat the Iranian missile strikes and couldn't stop the strikes in Israel. So according to the leading American professors, for example, Pepe Escobar, they say that they already agreed and they argued that Trump's Iran game plan has backfired. Same as Professor Robert Pape, who also said that Trump is facing escalation trap, and their policy in Iran has failed. You look like Iranians are producing cost-effective drone warfare, so they are upper hand in that as well. And then, on another front, which is what is happening inside America, how people are viewing this war. Slowly, the narrative is, clearly changed. For example, a recent poll by IMEU suggests that more than 56% of the American voters believe that this is Israel war and it is benefiting Israel. And because of this war, the ordinary Americans are facing inflation, all these kinds of problems. So which is why you have noticed that in recent days and weeks, one of the major debates on American televisions related to the war on Iran is the coming of civil war inside America and what is happening inside Israel, where young people are standing up and they are against government. A few weeks ago, recently, the sitting prime minister in Britain, they lost elections because of the British policy on Gaza and Israel. So overall, you see, yes, I agree with you that Washington have failed, as the first guest, respected professor, said that when the war started, they were thinking this is just a easy thing just to invade Iran and like Venezuela, but Iran is not Venezuela. It reminds me of the same historical event back in 1965 when the Indians generals they were dreaming of having a coffee or in Lahore, Pakistani city, but when they attacked, it was opposite. The Pakistanis took their land. So same is happening in Iran, that the dream of ground forces invasion, that's not coming true. So with all these things, following the analysis of experts, defense experts inside America who had fought wars in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, Colonel McGregor, there are so many. So they have completely lost this war, and I already have written on this, the other people as well. The Trump administration alone requesting over $200 billion to fund this war in Iran. The overall, the losses so far, naval and all that, Air Force and all that, you summing up. So they have lost Another thing which is very important to note is what is happening inside Europe, because nations like Spain and Ireland are avoiding joining the mission to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. In brief, yes, they have failed to figure it out. And perhaps also because the war is like a business for America. They one after another, they have to go to war because it's their economy. And the part B, just quickly, you said how important is Pakistan. Yes, it is very important for Pakistan's mediating role because of the remittances coming from Gulf. There are over 7 million Pakistanis there, and not only Pakistanis. The India, they are getting 40 billion remittances from Gulf. So I'm really disappointed to see the Indian role. They are not only, they should have supported Pakistan on this to come forward and to mediate, rather than the Indians are involved in dirty games.
Clear, Dr. Raja. Thank you. Now let me bring in Dr. Ivan Ridley now. Dr. Ivan, while Washington speaks about security in the Strait of Hormuz, it also continues shielding Israel from accountability in Gaza. And you may have been following the latest gruesome events, technically. How do you explain what critics are calling the contradiction between seizing Iranian assets in the name of global security while continuing to fund and arm Israel during its military campaign in Gaza?
Well, it's a confusing situation, and we've just heard from the other panelists, their view of what is happening. Iran has reasserted its control over the Straits of Hormuz, warning foreign commercial and military vessels will be targeted if they don't comply with regulations governing passage through the strategic waterway. But this has come after the United States signaled that President Donald Trump was close to a decision on a potential deal with Iran, although Tehran is saying that no such agreement had been reached. So we're getting two very conflicting stories here. America seems to be the one that is scrambling around for some solid ground, whereas Iran seems to be quite definite in the direction that it's going. The management of the Strait of Hormuz is exercised with the full authority of the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And, they are very much in control. And their message to the rest of the world's media seems to be that way. But America is giving off all sorts of mixed signals, and it's very, very difficult to read. There's obviously a lot of friction within the inner circle of Trump. They obviously can't agree on what strategy to do now. And we keep hearing about this memorandum of understanding, and the Vice President, J.D. Vance, confirmed that negotiators are still going back and forth. The rest of the world is watching. We're all hanging on to the edge of our seats because everybody is being affected, from ordinary van drivers, as I keep on saying, who go to fill their vehicles up with fuel. We're all waiting for some sort of concrete clarity coming from the White House, and it's just not clear at all. What is clear is that Israel is determined to put a spoke in the wheel because they are not happy with this 20-point memorandum of understanding. They apparently, and we get mixed messages from them as well, but according to Ben Gvir yesterday, he said that Donald Trump will not do a peace deal with Iran because that is not what Israel wants, which, if his words are true, that's incredible, that the most powerful country in the world, the United States of America, is being held hostage by this tiny little state in the Middle East, which isn't even the size of an African game park. So the whole picture is very confusing. I would love to be able to tell you what's going on, but I don't think any of us really know for sure how this is going to end.
Perfect, Dr. Ivan. And now let me get back to Dr. Zarour. Dr. Zarour, if we come back to look at the Donald Trump and Xi summit, President Donald Trump went to Beijing hoping to use China's energy interest to pressure Tehran, but he left actually without a major breakthrough. So does this summit actually show that Washington can no longer rely on the China card to isolate its adversaries? And is the United States losing influence within the emerging multipolar order?
Well, there's certainly a decline in American foreign policy influence in not only in the region but globally. China hosted two summits, one with President Trump, one with President Putin, but back to back. So it shows that China is gaining ground. They are playing the international game very successfully. They have the economic power. The U.S. economy is, of course, still top of the line. And certainly the U.S. military power, but the U.S. kind of have leveled off its power and economic military might have been leveled, reached the summit, whereas China is still climbing. And this is what worries Washington, and this is what worries people in the region. So they are realigning themselves. A lot of powers in the region, certainly Japan is trying to negotiate peace deals with China. China is a rising power. We have to accept the fact. And miscalculations from the Trump administration, really since the Bush 43, back in 2003, we have seen a declining American prestige in the world. We have seen the United States have been marginalized and sidelined economically and militarily. So that's exactly the reason why I think Mr. Trump failed to gain any ground in his summit with the Chinese premier. So I think Chinese premier is noticing that. There's a lot of support for China in the third world countries, rising, especially in the Middle East. So the U.S., as long as the U.S. Attaches itself to Israeli right, you're going to see a major decline in American foreign policy influence.
But then what do you say, Dr. Zarour, to those who actually painted a very beautiful picture of the summit, saying that Donald Trump did not fail actually in that summit, and he came back with some important trade deals with China, and they said that the two big powers or superpowers can actually bring better stability to the world if they cooperate on various fields. And they mentioned the aircraft deal, and a lot of pioneer businessmen were there in China, and it was like a positive picture. I've had a lot of experts on the show, and they said that they disagreed that it didn't really fail. How would you comment on that?
Well, I think both sides realize they need each other. I think the Chinese premier mentioned, correctly so, he wants to avoid the war between Sparta and Athens, 423 BC. So he wants to avoid that with the U.S. Competition with the U.S. doesn't help China at all. But even though it was not total, a failure for the Trump administration, there were some positive moments, but only big major CEOs are gaining. but the American public isn't gaining. The United States is opening up its markets to Chinese goods much more than before. We have in the US, at least the Trump administration, decided to shy away from imposing the sanctions, and that shows weakness. It shows caving in to Chinese demands. And the Chinese always follow, one a rule, and that is speaks softly but carry big stick. Now, the Trump administration speaks loudly and carries no stick. And this is the difference here. But the two sides need to collaborate to maintain peace and security, not only in Asia, but the global outreach, different regions of the world, Africa especially, and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Dr. Zarour. Now, let me go back to Dr. Peter Sack now. Building on the same point, China has called for an end to the militarization of the Strait of Hormuz while refusing to support the U.S. blockade. So the question is, the confrontation with Iran accelerating the decline of American influence and encouraging the global South to move away from the U.S. financial and geopolitical system, as we noticed in Dr. Zarour's analysis.
Well, I think I agree with Dr. Zaoud to a certain extent because essentially, when we look at Donald Trump's policy towards Venezuela, Iran, Panama, and also Greenland, everything resonates around US Chinese policy, as a matter of fact. And to see this, Trump basically explains lots of the things which we are actually witnessing, because clearly United States is afraid of the major competitor to its global hegemony. China is on the rise. China has been on the rise for the last 40 years. And yes, closing Strait of Hormuz is definitely affecting Chinese interests in the region. So if we're about to explain it through the prism of geopolitics, that's for sure could be one explanation for sure. But essentially, when it comes to the competition between global powers, China, Russia, United States, and maybe Europe, we need to also observe it from a different perspective, maybe their strategic cultures. And in particular, China has been influenced by Sun Tzu, and Sun Tzu suggests to be patient. And China has been so successful in growing rapidly because China has been quite peaceful for the last 40, 45 years. China hasn't waged war ever since 1960s, I believe. And the United States is recklessly starting war every year or every 2 years. And these days, United States is starting wars which have no exit strategy. And especially this is concerning, considering the fact that Donald Trump won president election by promising to his MAGA voters that he will end wars. He promised that he will end the war in Ukraine in one day. He promised that he will end the war in Gaza in one day. And in the meantime, he's escalating different wars. He didn't get his Nobel Peace Prize last year. So now he's a little bit like his ego is a bit affected, and he changed his policy. His true colors came to light. And some say that American administration, Donald Trump administration, would love to basically find some way to establish some memorandum of understanding between US and Iran. But Israel is definitely wanting to escalate. Israel is afraid of Iranian capability to develop nuclear weapons, and Israel is very right to be afraid, because after this, what we witness in Gaza for the last 3 years, when Iran will get nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons might be used against Israel. So you see, everything is connected in global politics, and that's why Israel cannot allow itself to be basically removed from these negotiations. Israel has to find a way to persuade Donald Trump to keep escalating, because that distracts Iran from its main strategy of getting the bomb. And essentially, that's causes lots of concerns to us all. And only if we've heard to Kenneth Waltz, who wrote an article back in 2012, he published that in Foreign Affairs, suggesting that Iran should get the bomb. Because if Iran got the bomb back then, Israel or United States would have never attacked Iran in 2026 or 2025, and the situation in the region would stabilize.
Clear, Dr. Pietrczak. Now, as we are reaching the end of the special coverage, I would like to give the two last questions to Dr. Raja and Dr. Yvonne Ridley, but quickly. So, Dr. Raja, the economic consequences of this, you had Israeli led escalation, technically they are significant. A quarter of the world's crude oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So by enforcing this naval blockade, is Washington effectively placing pressure on both global South economies and European energy markets in order to force political concessions from Iran? And as we have heard from Dr. Pietrczak, technically, even if the United States wanted a strategic exit, it cannot be without making sure that Iran has no nuclear bomb.
Well, thank you. Very briefly, I think the Washington policy is in working reverse. Is in reverse. The reason being is, you see, instead of placing pressure on both global South economies and the European economies, which are really affected, the skyrocketing prices, energy prices, and all that. But despite this, you see that common people, like ordinary people in Europe and in global South, they are very much against this war, and instead US is using support, they are losing support actually. Look into the Ipsos Mori poll. Very recently they found that 81% of the UK residents, and they are against this war. And same is true in other European countries, and same goes very true in several countries across global South, despite the fact that because of this war, the South Asian states are more suffering, and not only in terms of energy crisis, but also because there are millions of people from South Asia, including India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. They work there in the GCC countries, and these three countries, they got, for example, India got 40 billion in remittances. The Pakistanis received 38 billion in remittances just last year. So overall, I don't think so there will be some concessions from Iran, because their policy is very, very clear. Iran is a sovereign country, and they have every right to protect their sovereignty and stand on it. Like otherwise, this war game plan by America, it will continue to other countries in context to the Greater Israel project.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And now, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, very briefly as well, as we are reaching the end, we can see opposition growing inside the United States and across Europe against the war, with many describing it as a proxy conflict or war linked to Israel's regional agenda. So do you believe domestic political pressure in the West could eventually force a policy shift, or are pro-Israel hardliners largely unaffected by public criticism and reach their goal of destroying Iran completely, or at least making it unable to make any nuclear bomb?
Well, Washington has effectively outsourced its Middle East foreign policy to the Israeli far right, turning the United States into a hyperactive security guard rather than a global superpower. So while the Trump administration spends precious geopolitical capital in trillions of dollars chasing regional proxies in Lebanon and Yemen, it is completely missing the bigger picture. We are playing a costly, short-sighted game of whack-a-mole in the Levant, while Beijing is quietly playing chess across the global stage. Beijing's endgame doesn't require firing a single shot. They just have to sit back and watch America exhaust itself. In fact, the whole world can see this unfolding. Everyone can see it apart from Donald Trump. Every US precision missile dropped on a drone launch pad in the Middle East is a missile that isn't deterring a move on Taiwan. And every spike in oil prices just accelerates China's massive push into the domestic green energy independence. Trump is priding himself on being the ultimate deal maker. But right now, China is getting the bargain of the century. Total freedom to build its economic empire right across Africa and Asia, while Washington remains hopelessly trapped in a 20th century desert quagmire. So the ultimate endgame of this administration's miscalculations is strategic bankruptcy. You cannot claim to be successfully pivoting to counter a rising high-tech superpower like China when your entire military apparatus is permanently pinned down trying to referee a century-old border dispute. If Washington doesn't detach its grand strategy from the ideological red lines of its allies and start managing its overextension, the history books will show that America didn't lose its superpower status to a rising China. It simply traded it away for a front row seat to an endless war. And on a final note, because I know you're closing shortly, it's somebody mentioned, one of the panelists mentioned Sun Tzu earlier on, and Sun Tzu warned that he who defends everywhere defends nowhere. Right now, Washington is trying to police every corridor in the Middle East, which means we are actually protecting nothing, least of all our own long-term interests against China. So I think somebody ought to get a copy of The Art of War to Donald Trump, although he notoriously doesn't read books beyond the first and last page. Mm-hmm. But it would be well worth getting him a copy of Sun Tzu's thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yvonne. Well, we have to leave it there, unfortunately. My thanks to all my guests tonight, Dr. Khudra Zarour, Dr. Piotr Pietrsak, Dr. Irfan Raja, and Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Thank you all for your insights. Well, the contracts remain actually clear. While the United States uses financial pressure, diplomatic leverage, and military threats against Iran, it continues back in Israel as the occupation expands further in Gaza. The Trump-Xi summit also showed that major international actors are increasingly unwilling to fully align with unilateral American pressure. And at the same time, the resilience of targeted states suggests that the international balance of power continues to shift. Thank you to our viewers for following this All 24 News special coverage for tonight. And until next time, have a good one.